The garden hose hissed before the HOA president screamed. That was the part everyone remembered. Not the 7-foot raised serpent head, not the coils winding neatly through my flower bed like a jungle exhibit, not the little brass plaque that read Irrigation Sculpture, Functional Decorative Water Feature. No, what people remembered was Mrs. Calloway stepping onto my lawn in white capri pants, pointing at the giant green snake, and hearing water spray softly from its mouth into my roses. She froze. Then she whispered, "It's alive." Gary, from across the street, lowered his coffee mug. "It's connected to city water, so technically yes." Mrs. Calloway shrieked loud enough to startle 2 pigeons off my roof. I looked at the little camera near my porch and said, "If you're watching Sovereign Verdict, subscribe now, because this is what happens when an HOA Karen fines a man for a messy garden hose and accidentally inspires reptile-based landscaping." My name is Miles Carter, and I did not set out to terrify the Garden Standards Committee. I just wanted to water my late wife's roses. The roses were the only dramatic thing about my yard before all this started. Red, pink, yellow, white, and one strange orange bush my wife, Hannah, had loved because she said it looked like sunset caught in petals. She planted them along the front walkway 5 years before she passed. Back then, I complained about the thorns, the pruning, the fertilizer, and the way every garden center trip somehow cost more than dinner out. But after she was gone, those roses became sacred. I watered them every morning before work. Not because they needed that much water, probably. I am not a professional gardener. But because standing there with the hose in my hand, listening to the quiet spray and watching the sun hit the petals, made the house feel a little less empty. The problem was the hose. It was long, green, and old. I kept it coiled beside the front spigot near the porch. Some mornings, if I was rushing, the coil looked less like a coil and more like a defeated spaghetti pile. Not ideal, not beautiful, but functional. Then Mrs. Diane Calloway noticed. Mrs. Calloway was the president of the Maple Ridge HOA and chairwoman of the Landscape Presentation Board, which was a very serious name for 3 people arguing about mulch depth. She drove a white golf cart with a little basket full of violation forms. Her hair was silver, sprayed into a shape that could survive storm warnings. She wore floral scarves, pearl bracelets, and the expression of someone who believed watering tools were moral choices. She arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was deadheading roses. "Miles," she called from the sidewalk. Not Mr. Carter, Miles. She had a way of using first names like she was scolding a child. I turned. "Morning, Diane." Her eyes went straight to the hose. "Oh dear," she said. That was never a good start. She stepped carefully onto the edge of my lawn, avoiding the grass like it might contaminate her shoes. This hose situation has become visually unacceptable. I looked at the coil beside the porch. It's a hose. It is an exposed, tangled, unsightly watering apparatus. That is also a hose. She opened her clipboard. Section 5, Paragraph H requires all garden tools, hoses, reels, sprayers, and irrigation accessories to be concealed from public view when not actively in use. I'm actively using it. At this exact moment, yes, but multiple residents have observed it lying messily near the porch at various times. Multiple residents? She paused. Concern has been expressed. That meant Diane had expressed concern to herself, written it down, and counted it as community feedback. I sighed. "I can buy a hose reel." "It must be approved." "Of course it must." She handed me a violation notice, $500 if the hose remained visible after 48 hours. Additional penalties if the yard continued to display what she called irrigation disorder. I stared at the phrase, irrigation disorder. Somewhere, Hannah would have laughed until she cried. I tried to explain that the hose was there because the roses needed regular watering. I told her they had belonged to my wife. I told her I would tidy the coil, but I didn't want to hide everything away because I used it every morning. For a moment, Diane looked at the roses. Her face softened, maybe because even she could recognize beauty when it was blooming right in front of her. Then she tapped the violation notice. Sentimental value does not exempt visible clutter. There it was, the sentence that always turns a petty complaint into a mission. I looked down at the old green hose, then at the roses, then at Diane's perfect little clipboard. "You want it concealed?" I asked. "Yes." "Or made decorative?" She blinked. "Decorative features may remain visible if approved." I nodded slowly. Decorative, visible, functional. Hannah used to say I had a dangerous imagination when annoyed. She was right. Diane smiled, thinking she had won. "I'm glad we understand each other." "Oh," I said, folding the violation notice and slipping it into my pocket. "We absolutely do." Because if Maple Ridge wanted my garden hose to stop looking like a mess, I was going to make sure it looked like something nobody in the neighborhood could ever ignore. That evening, I sat in the garage with Diane's violation notice on the workbench and my old green hose coiled at my feet. The thing really did look tired. Sun-faded in some places, kinked in others, patched near the nozzle with black tape from a repair I had meant to redo 2 summers ago. Hannah used to tease me about that hose. She said it looked like a snake that had given up on ambition. That memory stayed with me. A snake. I opened the Maple Ridge HOA rule book and found Section 5, Paragraph H. Diane had quoted the hose rule correctly. Hoses and irrigation tools had to be concealed from public view when not in active use. But the next subsection said something different. Functional garden art, decorative water features, sculptural irrigation installations, and ornamental hose guides may remain visible if maintained, safely secured, and integrated into approved landscaping. I read it twice. Then I laughed. Sculptural irrigation installations. That was the most HOA phrase imaginable, but it was also a door. Diane had not told me to stop watering. She had told me the hose couldn't look messy. The rules allowed functional garden art. My wife had called the hose a tired snake. So I was going to give the snake ambition. The next morning, I called my neighbor Gary. Gary was retired, bored, and owned more tools than any normal suburban man could justify. When I explained the plan, he went silent for a few seconds. "You want to turn the hose into a giant snake?" "A functional decorative irrigation sculpture." "Right," he said. "A snake, with water spraying from the mouth." There was another pause. "I'll bring copper pipe." By noon, Gary and I were standing in my front yard, sketching the shape with landscaping flags. The plan was simple, but absurd. The old green hose would become the visible outer coil, secured neatly along a low metal frame winding through the rose bed. Under it, a hidden black irrigation line would carry water to the plants. At the far end, near the orange rosebush Hannah loved, the hose would rise into a sculpted serpent head made from lightweight resin, painted deep green with gold details. The nozzle would sit inside the mouth. When turned on, the snake would water the roses. It was ridiculous. It was also exactly within the rule. I spent 3 days building it. After work, I shaped the frame, cleaned the hose, mounted it neatly, and added decorative brass clamps so it looked intentional. Gary helped build the serpent head from a garden statue shell he found online and modified with far too much enthusiasm. We gave it curved eyes, a raised neck, and a mouth open just enough for the spray nozzle. At first I worried it was too much. Then I imagined Hannah seeing it. She would have laughed. Then she would have told me the eyes needed more drama. So I added more drama. By Saturday morning, the snake was finished. It coiled through the front flower bed, bright green against dark mulch, rising near the roses like some ancient garden guardian. It was clean, secured, and surprisingly beautiful in a strange way. The water line worked perfectly. When I turned the spigot, the snake sprayed a gentle fan of water over Hannah's roses. For the first time in a long while, I stood there and smiled without forcing it. Then Diane arrived. Her golf cart stopped so suddenly one wheel bumped the curb. She sat frozen behind the steering wheel, staring at the rose bed. Then she slowly stepped out, clutching her clipboard. "Miles," she said, voice thin, "why is there a serpent in your landscaping?" "It's not a serpent," I said. "It's a sculptural irrigation installation." Gary, standing beside the garage, whispered, "Very different species." Diane ignored him and walked closer. The snake hissed softly as water sprayed from its mouth. She jumped back. "It makes noise. It waters roses. It is frightening. It is functional garden art," she pointed at the coils. "That is the same hose. Reused materials. Very sustainable." Her mouth tightened. "You are mocking the standards." "No, I'm following the Decorative Water Feature exception." I handed her a printed copy of the rule. She read it. Her face changed slowly from anger to something worse. Legal inconvenience. "This requires approval," she said. "I submitted the form yesterday. I have not approved it. You also haven't denied it." She looked toward the snake's golden eyes. Water glistened on the rose petals behind it. For a second, the whole yard looked alive in a way it had not since Hannah was there choosing flowers. Diane must have sensed the emotion, because she softened her voice in that fake way people use right before they do something cruel. "I understand you are attached to the roses," she said. "But grief does not make lawn decor appropriate." The yard went quiet. Even Gary stopped smiling. I looked at the snake, then at the orange roses, then back at Diane. "You're right," I said softly. "Grief doesn't make it appropriate." She nodded, satisfied. "The rules do," I added. Her eyes hardened. "Emergency board hearing," she said. "Tonight, 7 o'clock." I turned off the water. The snake stopped hissing. The roses dripped in the sun. Diane climbed into her golf cart and drove away, leaving the violation notice flapping against my workbench where I had clipped it that morning. Gary walked over and stood beside me. "She really said that about grief?" "Yeah." He looked at the snake. "Hannah would have wanted bigger fangs." I laughed before I could stop myself. Then I went inside to prepare the folder. The Maple Ridge clubhouse smelled like lemon cleaner, burnt coffee, and judgment. I walked in at 6:55 with my folder under one arm and a photo of the snake sculpture tucked inside the front pocket. The room was fuller than I expected. Apparently, giant hose snake hearing had moved through the neighborhood faster than actual useful announcements. People filled the folding chairs, whispering like they were waiting for a magic show or a trial. Diane Calloway sat at the center of the board table in a pale blue blazer, floral scarf, and the expression of a woman preparing to defend civilization from reptiles. Beside her sat 3 board members: Carol, who looked nervous, Martin, who looked entertained, and Ruth, who was already reading the rulebook with a highlighter. Diane banged the gavel. "This emergency session concerns Lot 22, she announced, where Mr. Miles Carter has responded to a simple garden hose violation by installing a large snake figure in his front landscaping." Someone in the back whispered, "Legend." Diane's eyes snapped toward the audience. I stepped to the podium. Diane leaned into her microphone. "Mr. Carter, you may explain why this board should allow a frightening reptile sculpture to remain in public view." I opened my folder. "Thank you. First, the hose was cited because it was visible and messy. The revised installation is visible but no longer messy. It is secured, maintained, integrated into landscaping, and functions as irrigation." "It is a snake," Diane said. "It is a sculptural irrigation installation." Martin leaned forward. "Is that the actual phrase in the rules?" I held up the highlighted page. "Yes. Functional garden art, decorative water features, sculptural irrigation installations, and ornamental hose guides may remain visible if maintained, safely secured, and integrated into approved landscaping." Ruth looked down at her own copy. "He's quoting it correctly." Diane's lips tightened. The rule was intended for tasteful fountain systems and decorative hose pots. "Then it should have said that," I replied. "A few residents murmured." Diane banged the gavel lightly. "Order." I placed photos on the table. "The sculpture uses the original hose as a secured decorative coil. A hidden irrigation line feeds the roses. The raised head contains the nozzle, which produces a gentle watering spray. It does not block the sidewalk. It does not extend beyond the flower bed. It is not sharp, motorized, lit, noisy, or unsafe." Gary, from the second row, whispered, "Sadly not motorized." I ignored him for my own legal safety. Carol studied the photos. "It is cleaner than the hose pile." "Exactly," I said. Diane leaned back. "Clean does not mean appropriate." "No," I said. "But the rule does not ban snakes." Martin tried to hide a smile. Failed. Diane turned to the board. "The visual impact is disturbing. Homeowners should not be forced to pass a giant snake while walking through the community." Ruth looked at the photo again. "It's in his rose bed, not on the sidewalk." "It can be seen from the sidewalk." "So can Halloween decorations," Martin said. "This is not seasonal." "It waters flowers," he said. The room laughed. Diane's voice sharpened. "Mr. Carter is deliberately mocking this board." I felt the humor drain from my face. "No," I said quietly. "I'm protecting something my wife left behind." The room shifted. Diane's expression flickered. I continued. "Those roses were planted by Hannah before she died. I water them every morning because it keeps me connected to her. You fined me over the hose. Fine, I fixed the hose. I made it neat. I made it functional. I made it decorative under your rule. But what I will not do is let this board turn my grief into clutter because the tool I use to care for her garden doesn't look elegant enough." Nobody spoke. I pulled out a photo of Hannah standing beside the roses years earlier, smiling with dirt on her hands and sun in her hair. I did not want to use it, I did not want to put that part of my life in front of a room of neighbors. But Diane had already dragged it there when she told me grief did not make lawn decor appropriate. "This is not about a snake," I said. "It is about whether the rules exist to keep things safe and maintained, or whether they exist so one person can erase anything that makes her uncomfortable." Diane's face hardened again. "Emotional attachment cannot dictate landscape policy." Before I could answer, Ruth spoke. "No, but written policy should." Diane turned toward her. "Excuse me?" Ruth held up the highlighted rule. "The policy allows sculptural irrigation installations." Diane looked furious. "With approval." "And we are here to decide approval," Ruth said. At that exact moment, the clubhouse doors opened. Linda, from 2 streets over, walked in carrying a basket of roses. Not store-bought roses. Mine. She had asked that morning if she could cut a few for a neighborhood charity luncheon. I had forgotten all about it. Linda walked to the front, set the basket on the table, and looked at the board. "These came from Miles's rosebed," she said. "The one watered by the terrifying snake." The room laughed softly. Linda looked at Diane. "I understand rules, I really do. But I also understand beauty. That hose sculpture may be strange, but it is cared for. Those roses are cared for. Maybe that should count for something." The basket filled the room with the faint scent of flowers. Diane stared at it like the roses had betrayed her. Ruth leaned toward her microphone. "I'd like the board to inspect the installation before voting." Diane closed her eyes briefly. Gary whispered, "Field trip to the snake." And 10 minutes later, half the HOA meeting was walking down the sidewalk toward my house to judge a garden hose that had become a serpent. The walk to my house felt like the strangest neighborhood parade Maple Ridge had ever seen. Diane marched at the front with her clipboard held tight against her chest. Ruth walked beside her with the rulebook open. Martin followed with his phone out, pretending to check notes while clearly hoping the snake did something dramatic. Linda carried the basket of roses. Gary brought up the rear, whispering to anyone who would listen that serpent irrigation was an underappreciated field. When we reached my yard, the sun was beginning to set. The rosebed glowed in warm, evening light. The green coils of the hose wound neatly through the mulch, secured with brass clamps and low black stakes. The serpent head rose near Hannah's orange rose bush, its gold-painted eyes catching the last light. It was strange, yes. It was impossible to ignore. But it was not messy. It was not dangerous. It was not neglected. It looked like someone cared. Ruth stepped forward first. "Turn it on, please." I walked to the spigot and opened the valve. For a second, nothing happened. Then the snake hissed softly, and a gentle spray of water fanned from its mouth across the roses. Droplets caught the sunset, scattering little sparks of light over the petals. The orange roses trembled under the mist. The crowd went quiet. Even Diane did not speak. Martin looked down at the flower bed, then at the hose coils. "It waters evenly." "Yes," I said. "Better than when it was lying in a pile." Carol checked the sidewalk clearance. "It doesn't block the walkway." "No?" Ruth crouched slightly, inspecting the frame. "Secured, no sharp edges." Gary leaned toward Martin. "The snake has passed safety review." Diane finally found her voice. "It is still visually alarming." Linda looked at the roses, then at Diane. Only if you are determined to be alarmed. That landed harder than expected. Diane's face tightened, but the board members had seen enough. The installation did exactly what the rule required. It was functional garden art. It was sculptural irrigation. It was safely secured and integrated into landscaping. It was also absurd, but absurd was not prohibited. We returned to the clubhouse 20 minutes later. The room was buzzing. People had seen the water spray. They had smelled the roses. They had watched Diane's complaint shrink from public nuisance to personal dislike. By the time everyone sat down, even the gavel sounded less confident. Diane cleared her throat. The board will now consider whether the installation at Lot 22 meets community standards. Ruth spoke before Diane could frame the question too narrowly. I move to approve the hose sculpture as a functional sculptural irrigation installation under Section 5, Paragraph H, subject to maintenance, safe operation, and no expansion beyond the existing flower bed without review. Martin raised his hand. Second. Diane stared at him. Martin, he shrugged. It's weird, Diane, but it follows the rule. Carol nodded. And it looks maintained. Diane's voice sharpened. So we are now approving giant snakes? Ruth looked at her calmly. We are approving one secured irrigation sculpture that waters a rose garden. All in favor? Martin asked. Ruth raised her hand. Martin raised his. Carol raised hers. 3 votes. Diane's hand stayed flat on the table. The motion passes, Ruth said. The violation is rescinded. The applause was gentle at first, then stronger. Linda smiled at me. Gary gave an exaggerated thumbs up. Diane gathered her papers with stiff, angry movements and refused to look in my direction. 2 days later, the official email arrived. The fine was removed. The snake was approved. The HOA records listed it as a decorative irrigation feature. I had to keep it maintained, prevent leaks, and submit a new request if I added lighting, sound, motion, or additional animals. Gary was deeply disappointed by the additional animals clause. I printed the email and placed it in my folder beside the original violation notice. Then I went outside and watered the roses. The snake hissed softly. The roses brightened under the spray. The orange bush Hannah loved was blooming harder than it had in years, throwing out color like sunset had decided to grow from the ground. For a while, I just stood there. Grief changes shape over time. At first, it is a storm. Then it becomes silence. Then, if you are lucky, it becomes rituals. Morning coffee. A familiar song. A flower bed. A ridiculous green hose turned into a snake because someone tried to make you hide the tool you used to care for what was left. Diane still passed my house sometimes in her white golf cart. She never slowed down anymore. But every time the snake sprayed water, neighbors noticed. Kids loved it. Linda asked for roses again. Gary kept suggesting names like Sir Hissington and Hosea III. I pretended to hate those names, but one day I found myself writing Hosea on the maintenance log without thinking. Hannah would have loved that. She would have rolled her eyes first, of course. Then she would have laughed. Then she would have told me the snake needed more dramatic eyes. And she would have been right. So remember this from Sovereign Verdict. Subscribe for more stories. Read every line. Protect the little rituals that keep love alive. And never let an HOA Karen call your garden hose messy unless she is ready for it to become legendary.